a task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
As of March 31, 2022, 454 Hitler, The Hidden Toll of California's Black Exodus, SF Chronicle, July 25, 2020, as of March 31, 2022. Chapter 5. Civil War, federal, state, and local government officials, working with private individuals, actively segregated American land into black and white neighborhoods. Segregation occurred over almost 200 years, and through a variety of different government strategies and policies. And actions were intentional, and they supplemented and intensified the actions of private individuals. Widespread actions and the resulting segregation of African Americans, both nationwide and in California, are enduring badges and incidents of slavery because they continue to affect African Americans. Immediately after the Civil War, the country was racially and geographically configured in ways that were different from the way it is segregated today. Most African Americans lived in the rural South, on or near the land on which they had been enslaved, in shacks or former slave quarters. In the cities of the North and South, African Americans mostly lived in racially mixed neighborhoods, even though black residents lived in housing of worse quality and in back alleys. 3. An urban black person in 1890 lived in a neighborhood that was only 27% black. Since then, American federal, state, and local municipal governments amplified actions by private citizens to force African Americans into urban ghettos, while helping white Americans buy single-family homes in the suburbs. Rural America also became increasingly segregated, as black residents left the rural South for economic opportunity and to escape racial violence and terrorism. 6. Certain segregation methods were declared unconstitutional. Local governments ignored them or thought up new ways to reach the same goals. All the decisions of millions of private homeowners, real estate agents, and landlords settled Americans into segregated residential patterns. It was action by all levels of government which expanded and solidified these settlements into the segregated neighborhoods of today. 8. In the 1900s and the 1930s, local governments actively planned cities to be racially segregated. 9. The real estate industry promoted restrictive covenants, which clauses written into deeds that prohibited non-white residents from living in the house. 10. 1940, the average urban black person lived in a neighborhood that was 43% black. 11. From the 1930s to the 1970s, the United States federal government built public housing for white Americans, but not African Americans. The government helped white Americans, but not African Americans, buy houses in the suburbs. Throughout American history, up until the 1970s, white residents terrorized their black neighbors by destroying their property, bombing their houses, and burning crosses on their lawns to scare them away from living in white neighborhoods. For a more detailed discussion, please see Chapter 3, Racial Terror. 70, the average urban black person lived in a neighborhood that was 68% black. Even after the passage of the Federal Housing Act, which outlawed housing discrimination, urban renewal, and other uses of local government actions funded by the federal and state governments maintained residential segregation. 14. The problem of segregation has never been corrected. America is as segregated in 2019 as it was in the 1940s, with the average urban black person living in a neighborhood that is 44% black. 15. California, the population of African Americans remained small until World War II, when African Americans moved to the state to find jobs in the war industry. On the one hand, Southern California is an African American success story. As W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of Los Angeles and Pasadena in 1913, nowhere in the United States is the Negro so well and beautifully housed, nor the average efficiency and intelligence in the colored population so high. 18. And 36% of African Americans in Los Angeles owned homes, far more than most cities at the time. 19. On the other hand, all success is relative. State and local government in California helped create segregation through discriminatory federal housing policies, zoning ordinances, decisions on where to build schools, and a discriminatory federal mortgage policy called redlining. Joseph Pershing Foster, a migrant from the small town of Monroe, Louisiana, who moved to Los Angeles in the 1950s, said of his first days in California, "I came all this way running from Jim Crow, and it slaps me straight in the face." 21. Elsewhere in the country, the effects of these government policies at all levels continue to this day. In 2021, in Los Angeles and Orange counties, only 34% of black households owned homes, 22 less than in 1910. Yet this chapter describes the history of U.S. Supreme Court decisions which allowed residential segregation to intensify over the last 170 years. Ivy describes the state of residential segregation at the end of the Civil War, before government and private action segregated the American landscape. Section V, 6 and 7 explains how migration patterns across the country led states, cities and communities to exclude African Americans, how African Americans established their own communities in response and the racism that they faced in doing so. Sections 8, 13 details the various mechanisms used by federal, state and local governments to segregate America throughout history. Sections 14 and 15 describes the state of housing segregation today and its effects. 16 concludes that residential segregation in America is a result of white supremacist beliefs created to support enslavement and is the root of many modern-day racial disparities. Section 17 is an appendix of relevant data for reference. Each of these sections show the persisting effects of slavery in the context of housing. Sanctioned housing discrimination. The reason housing segregation has never been fixed in America is due in part to the Supreme Court. Discussed in Chapter 2, Enslavement, and Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement, although the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution banned actions that continued the effects of slavery, the Supreme Court of the United States decided in 1883 that the federal government could not prohibit racial discrimination by individual business owners and private parties. 23. This ruling later applied to housing. 24. As a result, government and private actors essentially ignored the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 14th Amendment protections against racial discrimination until Congress passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. 25. Did not end here. At the height of segregation in the 1970s, the U.S. Supreme Court popularized the myth that the American government had no role in creating housing segregation, and therefore should not and could not fix the personal choices of millions of private citizens. 26. The end of the Civil War. After the Civil War, the country was racially and geographically configured in ways that were different from the way it is segregated today. Immediately after the Civil War, between 1860 and 1900, almost 90% of African Americans lived in the South. 28 and 80% of those who lived in the South lived in rural areas. 9. Many black workers lived in former slave quarters, on the same plantation on which they had been enslaved. 30. Modern-day scholars agree that white and African Americans lived in the same geographic area in the cities at this time, although with unequal quality of housing. White families lived in front streets and broad avenues, and black families generally could only live in backyards, alleys, side streets, or their houses were separated by physical barriers. 2. Impoverished shanty towns of unemployed African Americans also appeared around southern cities in undesirable areas like swamps, near city dumps, and next to cemeteries and railroad tracks. 3. Ghettos were built up in nearly all southern cities, not always sharply defined but pretty definite, and in these, Negroes must live, wrote Dubois. 34. In time, less than 10% of African Americans lived in the North and less than 0 lived in the western states. 35. Most lived in urban areas. 36. That were much more segregated by neighborhood than in the South. 37. And in worse housing conditions than white Americans. 38. 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois' landmark sociological study of Philadelphia summed up the situation. Areas of people receiving a little lower wages than usual for less desirable work, and compelled, in order to do that work, to live in a little less pleasant quarters than most people. Pay for them somewhat higher rents. 39. Some used up to 75% of their income on rent, as real estate agents raised the rent for black tenants, because they knew many landlords did not rent to black tenants. 40. Most African Americans living in the North were only able to find jobs serving white families, and thus were forced to pay higher rents in the more expensive neighborhoods close to their employers. 41. Around the end of the Civil War, African Americans were few in number compared to other racial groups. The 1860 census counted 4,086 total free-colored, 17,798 Indian, and 34,933 Asiatic people in California. As a result of their small numbers, Black Californians at the time generally lived in multi-ethnic communities 43 and occasionally also lived in small predominantly Black communities. For example, a group of 44 settlers, half of whom were of African descent, who traveled from Sinaloa, Mexico, established a settlement that later became Los Angeles in 1781. 45 during the Mexican War, from 1846 to 1848, loss. Had a significant Black population as former enslaved African Americans were brought to the area. 46 in Northern California, there was also a concentrated Black population along the banks of the Sacramento River in a neighborhood comprised of Mexican and Chinese. 47 in that neighborhood, rowdy young men and boys attacked all three groups and vandalized Black and Chinese businesses. 8 African Americans also lived and worked in multi-ethnic mining communities such as Little Nigger Hill near Folsom Lake, California. 49 California had 4 counties with fewer than 10 Black residents in 1890. 1930, California had 8 counties with fewer than 10 Black residents, which author James Loewen argues is the result of intensified segregation. 51 Author Richard Rothstein argues that after the large influx of African Americans to the state in World War II, actions in California imposed racial segregation where it had not previously existed. 52. The Great Migration. In 1870 and 1900, many African Americans moved from rural to urban areas in the South, looking for better-paying jobs. Over the next 7 decades, as violence targeting African Americans intensified in the South, and as Southern states passed laws that relegated African Americans in nearly every aspect of life to worse conditions than white Americans, better jobs and the illusion of racial equality pulled African Americans out of the South to the North and the West. 54 This is called the Great Migration and, at its peak, 16,000 Black people left the South each month. 55 Historians have identified 3 migration paths out of the South, though not all African Americans followed these paths exactly. 56 The Eastern Path carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. 57 Path carried people from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Pittsburgh. The Western Path carried people from Louisiana and Texas to California and the rest of the West Coast. 59 More Black people moved to California in the 1940s than in the entire previous century of statehood combined. 60 The Black population of California mushroomed from 124,306 in 1940 to 1,400,143 in 1970. 61 By the end of the Great Migration in the 1970s, 47% of African Americans lived outside of the South. Although many African Americans left the South to escape discrimination, the lingering legacy of slavery, reinforced by government actions at all levels, followed them across the country. Historians have argued that the Great Migration led to an increase in racial violence in the North and West, and an intensification of residential segregation. 63. Exclusion or destruction of Black communities. Additionally, African Americans left the South, entire states like Indiana and Oregon outright banned African Americans from living in the state. 54 Peter Burnett, who later became the first governor of the state of California, was involved in passing these Oregon laws to ban Black residents from living in Oregon. 65. To entire states, many towns across the country became known as sundown towns, where African Americans were not allowed to remain after dark. 66. These rules were often unwritten, local sheriffs and armed, white mobs enforced them. 67 sundown towns were created largely between 1890 to 1940, and they legally continued to exist through 1968. The sociologist James Loewen argued that most suburbs in America began as sundown towns, and that the hometowns of 9 out of the 32 candidates for president in the 20th century were sundown towns. 9 For example, Harry Truman grew up in Lamar, Missouri, a legal segregation town of 3,000 without a single Black family. 70 George W. Bush lived in Highland Park, a sundown. Dallas that only welcomed its first Black homeowners in 2003. 71 Towns across the country became known as sundown towns, where African Americans were not allowed to stay after dark. These rules were often unwritten, local sheriffs and armed, white mobs enforced them. According to one scholar, California had more sundowntowns than the entire South. Like Indiana and Oregon outright banned African Americans from living in the state as they left the South, 72 California also tried to pass laws banning African Americans from settling in the state. Although the laws did not pass, the California legislature, dominated by white Southerners at the time, sent the clear message that African Americans were not welcome. 74. For further discussion, see Chapter 2, Enslavement. As residential segregation reached its height between 1940 to 1970, local governments and residents created scores of sundown towns and suburbs in California, 75 some by ordinance and some by force. 86 Sloan found evidence that 8 California counties effectively excluded black people. 77 white Californians rioted to expel black residents from California towns. 78 According to Lowen's research, California had more sundown towns than the entire South, which Lowen attributes to the culture of racism in the South preferring to exploit rather than exclude black residents. 79 His sundown towns included most of the suburbs of Los Angeles and San Francisco, and most of Orange County. These places gained a national reputation as sundown towns. 81 Lowen has collected research on numerous sundown towns throughout California. 82 A list of the sundown towns identified by Lowen is included in Table 3 in the appendix to this chapter. Flyers for the Maywood Colony, a suburban development surrounding Corning, California, announced, "Good people, in most communities in California you'll find Chinese, Japs, Dagos, Mexicans, and Negroes mixing up and working in competition with the white folks." Maywood Colony. Employment is not given to this element. 83. South Pasadena, in the late 1940s, the city administration, local civic leaders, and realtors tried to cover Pasadena with racially restrictive covenants. 84 A 1947 newspaper article noted the unusual and extreme extent of this effort. The goal was to blanket the entire city with racially restrictive covenants. 85. Matter of official policy, African Americans and other non-white persons were only allowed to work in South Pasadena if they left by dusk. Limited exceptions were made for live-in servants and caretakers, but they could not live in the city on their own, and often could not bring their children to live with them. This campaign to exclude all non-white residents from South Pasadena only failed after the Supreme Court ruled that racially restrictive covenants could not be enforced. 88. Freedmen's Town. From settling in entire geographic areas and escaping discrimination and racial violence, African Americans began building all-black towns in the 19th century in the Southwest, Midwest, and West. 89 Also known as Freedmen's Towns, these towns developed in order to, in the words of one Blacktown newspaper editor, exercise freedom as freedom was understood by the Traveler's Green Book. The annual guide is for services in places relatively friendly to African Americans. 1959. Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the New York Public Library. Americans, 90 Approximately 100 such towns were built between early 1800s and mid-1900s. 91 A particularly large number of African Americans migrated to Kansas. Oklahoma had over 30 all-black towns. 93 other states with such towns included Texas, Iowa, New Mexico, and Michigan, as well as some in the former enslavement states of Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. 94. There is not much research on this topic. Some records suggest that there were at least 15 black towns in California between 1850 and 1910. 95 The best known and most successful was Allensworth, 40 miles north of Bakersfield. 6 Allen Allensworth, a formerly enslaved lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army, founded Allensworth with others in 1908. 97 The town attracted disillusioned black migrants who had fled the South, but found a different type of discrimination in California. 98. Other black towns in California, Allensworth was self-governing, and at the height of its success before the Great Depression, over 300 families constructed churches, a library, a school, and a general store. 89 Black midwives cared for the health of the community, as most doctors in nearby towns refused to take black patients unless the patient was employed by a white rancher. 100. Worth spent more money on its schools than its neighboring school districts. 1 Cornelius Pope, who lived in Allensworth and attended school there as a child, remembered that his teacher Oworth Hall welcomed him to the Allensworth School and with open arms and asked, "Learned something from you today?" 102 When Pope left Allensworth, he said, "It didn't take me long to find out that I was equal to the very best. I was just as powerful, could think just as good, there was nothing inferior about me. I was pretty hard to stop from there on in." 103. Despite Allensworth's success, it was never truly independent. It had to rely on the government and white-owned companies that controlled the water, the railroad, and job markets. For in testimony to the task force, Terence Dean argues that water, land, and railroad companies discriminated against the town, leading to its demise. 5. The Pacific Farming Company, after first selling land plots to the black settlers at inflated prices, then prohibited land sales to African Americans, which limited the town's growth. 6. Despite its promises, the Pacific Water Company built only 4 water wells for Allensworth, compared to the 10 wells it built in a neighboring white town. 7. The water dried up within 2 years and was contaminated with alkaline at first, then arsenic in 1967. 108. The founders maintained that the settlers were victims of a racist scam and were sold land that would never have enough water. 109. Was founded, Allensworth was on the Santa Fe Railroad's main line, which allowed the town to derive revenue from the rail stop. 110. In 1914, the rail line was diverted away from Allensworth. 11. Not being able to earn revenue from the railroad stop or farming alone, residents worked multiple jobs in the surrounding, discriminatory white communities. 12 young people left the town to find jobs elsewhere, and Allensworth slowly died and disappeared as economic opportunities decreased and the water calcified. 113. It was established as a state park in 1974, but remained critically underfunded and unbuilt until the 2000s. 114. Lieutenant Colonel Allen Allensworth founded an all-black town outside of Bakersfield with 4 other settlers. Today, Allensworth is a California state park. 1926. And Paul Milstein Division of United States History, the New York Public Library.